and welcome to a jolly good episode of the Oddity Archive, mate. Okay, we've taken our little side trips across the pond before, but today we're going to tackle our first ever, ostensibly UK-centric, regular archive episode. Now, in the early days of home computing, here in the States, we mostly pretty quickly adopted the floppy disk as our preferred storage medium. But it's not like we didn't have our cassette users here as well, but for all intents and purposes, this just wasn't that big a deal here. But meanwhile, especially over in Europe, this was the norm. And so today we're going to take a look at some of those more, at least from an American point of view, novel methods of storing and sharing stuff. And actually, before we get around to like cassettes, let's take a look at a pretty colossal undertaking in the UK back in 1985 and 6, which involved Laserdiscs. Way back in 1085, King William the Conqueror ordered the making of what became known as the Doomsday Book, which was spelled Domesday back then. This book, finished in 1086, effectively took stock of every asset in nearly every meaning of the word in England at the time, largely for taxation purposes. The book was so good that it was dubbed the Doomsday Book because it was felt that the book would only ever become obsolete on the Doomsday. In 1985, the BBC, Acorn Computers, home of the BBC line of computers, and a few others decided it was time to come up with a new and considerably less nefarious Doomsday Book. I can only guess that it was designed as part of the BBC's then ongoing efforts at mass computer education, and probably selling more BBC Micros. Anyway, given the sheer tonnage of information that needed to be gathered, it became obvious that standard floppy disks weren't going to cut it. So Philips was brought in to develop a system of mass storage. Philips opted to take their existing Laserdisc technology and expand it to include files compatible with Acorn's line of computers. This became known as LV-ROM, Laser Vision Read-Only Memory.
Information will be very easily accessible. It'll use the most up-to-date electronic publishing technology, interactive video disc. This is a powerful new method of information presentation.
The final Doomsday project was compiled on a pair of Laserdiscs at 648 megabytes of content per disc. One disc, the community disc, was devoted to written reflections of everyday life and a few pictures of specific areas. Specific as in each, if you will, chapter was devoted to a 4 by 3 kilometer area. The other disc, the national disc, consisted of the results of the 1981 census and an abundance of video clips and still images.
12-inch laser vision discs capable of holding both pictures and data, which are played on a new interactive optical player currently being developed by Philips Electronics.
The overall system that could take advantage of the Doomsday project consisted of a BBC master computer equipped with an early SCSI port, an Acorn VFS-ROM cartridge, a Philips VP415 Laserdisc/LV-ROM machine, a Marconi RB2 tracker ball mouse, and, of course, a monitor. The complete package was offered to anyone who wanted it at a cost of £5,000, adjusted for inflation, almost £14,000, equivalent to almost $20,000. Unsurprisingly, there weren't too many takers.
You'll create your own music video. You'll create your own movies.
Education will be fun.
I'm very excited about the future.
I think it's very exciting.
Just as a quick double postscript here, in the early 90s, Pioneer went back and took another crack at the LV-ROM concept, retitled LD-ROM for Laserdisc read-only memory. This was used on the ever-elusive laser-active video game / karaoke quote-unquote console, as well as the PC Engine add-on to the TurboGrafx 16 video game console. As for the Doomsday project, as early as 2002, some intrepid would-be historians began cobbling together a working Doomsday setup. In 2004, in cooperation with the BBC, the 1-inch videotape masters were backed up to Digibeta, and a Windows-compatible rebuild of the project was made available to the British National Archives. In 2011, in cooperation with the BBC, the Doomsday project was added to and re-released online. As of early 2018, the BBC site only remains partially available. However, while not explicitly stated, Doomsday86.com, the current handlers of the project, seem to be working on a full-blown emulator. As I mentioned earlier, particularly outside the US, the other major data storage medium was the otherwise plain old audio cassette. Now, back on the Commodore 64 episode, I actually had a segment lined up on the dataset peripheral, which was of course to be used with Commodore's line of computers, but I wound up having to throw it out. So, since we're back in that mode, I figured maybe we ought to just take a chunk out of this episode and discuss cassettes and computers in general.
Firm control of the business demands digging into the records again and again.
Prior to the advent of home computers, one of the two most common means of storing data was on tape, the other being paper. Unsurprisingly, tape carried over to early, operative word, home computers via the humble audio cassette. The three most common systems to adapt this technology were the Apple II and BBC Micro series, both of which you could plug nearly any cassette recorder into, and all major Commodore computers up through the C128, which all ran on the dataset. While 5 1/4-inch floppy drives had been available since the mid to late 70s, they usually cost about 8 to 10 times that of a dataset and potentially 15 to 20 times the cost of a basic cassette recorder. Depending on the specifics of the disc, this could also mean anywhere from 2 to 5 times the cost of a blank cassette. As such, for a lot of folks, this meant being, figuratively, stuck to tape, which meant load times in upwards of 20 minutes for a single program, compared to a couple of minutes for an equivalent program on a 5 1/4-inch floppy. Here in the States, it seems like the cost of the floppy drives and discs came down a bit quicker than they did anywhere else in the world. Add to that a certain impatience with the lengthy load times, and by about 1983 or so, most Americans that owned a home computer were willing to shell out for floppies. Meanwhile, especially in Europe, cassettes carried, in some circles, into the mid-90s. This, of course, meant that they experimented a lot more than we ever did. I can personally attest to the impatience and all-around frustration with computer programs on cassettes. Now, I wasn't able to cover it back on the Commodore 64 episode, but I do indeed have a data set, and you're obviously staring at it. But when I was trying to research that episode, I encountered so many problems that I wound up simply abandoning that leg of the episode. Now, of course, here in the States, not much software was issued on cassette, and if it was usually in pretty limited runs. So when I was trying to get that together, I found myself mostly stuck with downloading tap files, .tap, from abandonware sites. And I had/have exactly one original cassette, albeit not a mass-manufactured thing. And as I found out, this has just some super basic math game on it that's totally unremarkable. But otherwise, the name of the game was converting those tap files into .wav audio files, and then I just ran into a wall after that. So I tried using one of these car cassette adapter things, that you use to hook up a CD player, iPod, smartphone, whatever, to an older car with a cassette deck. And I tried playing the files, the WAV files, straight out of the computer to this, and that didn't work. And I tried burning them to CD and going via my Discman. That didn't work. And then I broke down and I started just making my own real honest-to-God cassettes of programs, and that was only intermittently successful. But the last straw came with an Elvira Mistress of the Dark game, and it was huge by these standards. And it took 15 plus minutes to load every time, and then it would freeze on me within a minute of starting the game every single time. So there's my little unsolicited tirade on cassette data storage. Now let's look at the two most notable, if you will, novelty methods of sharing programs. In 1977, some computer programs were beginning to be shipped out with enclosed flexi-disc records. The idea was for you to, depending on your machine, dub the disc to cassette and run the program, or to run your turntable via whatever means necessary directly into your computer. But sometimes this meant needing an additional interface, like the Tarbell cassette interface. By the end of the 70s, this method of sharing took on a more novelty approach. In 1979, Japanese classical artist Tomita included a bit of Tarbell code on his Bermuda Triangle album. Between 1983 and 92, artists including Hawkwind spin-off Inner City Unit and Information Society were including ZX Spectrum Easter eggs in their albums. Ex-Buzzcock Pete Shelley included a ZX Spectrum program at the end of the UK issue of his XL1 album, which you could load into your Spectrum, then stick the album back on your turntable and have a visual presentation to go along with the music. But most famous are the games that were occasionally either included with a single or album or used as a promotional item. Shakin' Stevens had a ZX Spectrum game included on the B-side of some pressings of his This Ol' House single. It was also quietly tucked away at the end of the UK cassette version of his The Bop Won't Stop album. Then there's the Thompson Twins game.
Hi, it's the Thompson Twins here.
I'm Alana.
I'm Joe. And I'm Tom, and you're listening to the computer game version of Dr. Doctor.
It's a pop music adventure all about us, with lots of prizes for the first people to solve the puzzles and phone computer and video games with the answers.
We've got t-shirts, albums, posters, and for the first person to solve the adventure, 2 tickets for our next concert.
The October 1984 issue of Computer and Video Games magazine came with a flexi-disc containing a ZX Spectrum game based around the group's then-current single, Dr. Doctor. As implied, there was a contest tied to this game. The objective was to successfully complete the game and share the outcome with the magazine. The grand prize? To attend a Thompson Twins concert and meet the group. I won't bore you with a let's play here, but let me just say that I have played the Commodore 64 port of this game, on an emulator at least, and once you figure out the logic of the game, and it helps immensely to read the original magazine article first, it's not too tough. You go around collecting stuff that can be ultimately made into some sort of potion, which you take to the Doctor to heal your burnin', and take a wild guess what kind of burnin' you're getting treated. And given the ultra-stiff movements of the band members in the game, even by 1984 standards, I'm guessing they all needed treatment. Oh yeah, the magazine wound up actually holding 2 separate contests for the ZX Spectrum and the mail-order-only Commodore 64 version. A winner to the Spectrum contest was announced in the January 1985 issue, again in Computer and Video Games magazine, and to the best of my research, the name of the Commodore 64 contest winner was never publicly announced, assuming that particular contest wasn't scrapped entirely.
Start recording now.
Okay, this one was what really caught my attention. With the release of the Acorn BBC Micro in 1981, the BBC itself embarked on a lengthy series of programs designed to get people interested in home computing. In December of 1981, the old Beeb transmitted a computer program over the air during an episode of their long-running tech show, Tomorrow's World. While it didn't go over too well in the studio, it was a success for many home viewers. In 1983, the Beeb got a little more ambitious and attempted an over-the-air packet exchange, telecommunications, explicitly for the BBC Micro. This backfired on the presenters quite spectacularly.
And Telecom Gold, automated office services, we're through. Mail call.
Computer security error.
I think we have some hackers. I think you tempted some hackers rather too well.
It's television, and computer programs are already being transmitted by the BBC as part of its teletext service.
Also in 1983, Acorn started selling a teletext adapter for use with the BBC Micro. Using a plain old aerial, you could plug into the adapter, as opposed to your TV, and download the odd program straight from the CFAX pages. Those unfamiliar with CFAX might want to go back and watch the teletext episode, because I'm not going over that again. Anyway, as a semi-related final point of interest, the final episode of the BBC's Making the Most of the Micro series, also 1983, ended with a data transmission. I spent 2.5 days trying every emulator and program and compatibility mode I could find to decode this and the 1981 Tomorrow's World transmissions, and about a dozen programs and a virus later, my efforts were for naught. I did find one person that was successful with the 1981 transmission, though. The end result was just as shown on Tomorrow's World.
Here they come. And the final name.
Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I go all war games on everyone. Albeit on a much, much lower budget.